There are wars that end with a treaty. There are wars that end with one final battle. But there are also wars that seem to never truly end. At one point, Donald Trump claimed that within just 7 months he had helped resolve 7 major conflicts around the world, from Cambodia and Thailand to Kosovo and Serbia, and even tensions involving Congo, Rwanda, Pakistan, and India. According to him, these were extremely violent conflicts where tens of thousands of people had died. Trump said that these wars eventually calmed down thanks to his intervention. He repeated this claim many times in public, presenting it as one of his greatest achievements. At times, the way he spoke about it made listeners feel as if he believed he could bring peace to the entire world. He even suggested that no president, prime minister, or country in history had ever accomplished something similar. And he said he felt deeply honored to have played that role. But those statements raise a much bigger question. If wars could truly be ended that easily, then why do new wars keep breaking out around the world? Why does conflict seem to repeat itself again and again throughout history? Because while speeches about peace are delivered in front of cameras, something very different is happening behind the scenes. A massive machine is still running quietly in the background. The war machine. And that machine generates enormous profits. Over the past several decades, global conflict has not disappeared. In fact, weapons have become more advanced, more destructive, and more technologically sophisticated than ever before. This leads to another question. And how exactly does the American arms industry shape the world? In reality, these companies are not simply manufacturing weapons. They are also shaping an entire narrative about war itself. Never before in history has a military budget approached $1 trillion simply to develop increasingly advanced weapons. And the justification for this spending often sounds the same. Peace through strength. It sounds logical at first. But history tells a more complicated story. During the Vietnam War, one major American weapons manufacturer recorded record-breaking profits. The company produced many of the firearms used by U.S. soldiers, including the now famous M16 rifle. As the war escalated, demand for weapons increased dramatically, and the company's revenue rose alongside it. At its peak, the company earned between $160 million and $190 million annually. At that time, it was an enormous amount of money. This illustrates something important. War is not just a military conflict. For many corporations, it is also a highly profitable business. Another example is Lockheed Martin, one of the largest defense contractors in the world. The company produces fighter jets, missiles, and advanced military systems for the United States and its allies. After the United States launched military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, Lockheed Martin's stock price surged dramatically. Between 2001 and 2020, the company's stock increased by nearly 900%. But the real irony appears when we look at more recent conflicts. While the United States sent billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine, the broader stock market did not perform particularly well. In fact, the New York Stock Exchange's average index fell by roughly 7% during that same period. Yet defense companies experienced the opposite trend. Lockheed Martin's stock rose by 42%. Northrop Grumman increased by 34%. General Dynamics climbed by 22%. In other words, while politicians appear on television talking about peace, the war industry is generating massive profits behind the scenes. Over time, the United States gradually realized something. War was not only a tool of foreign policy, it was also a massive business. This became even more obvious when the war in Ukraine began. As soon as Russian troops crossed the border, the stock prices of America's largest arms manufacturers began rising almost immediately, because whenever a war begins, demand for weapons increases. 15 fighter jets, 16 fighter jets, Patriot missile defense systems, precision-guided bombs, advanced military radar systems. These weapons deals are often worth tens of billions of dollars. All of this demonstrates a simple truth. The global arms industry is one of the largest businesses on Earth. But to truly understand how this machine was built, we need to go back further in history. The story really begins during World War II. Many people believe the United States quickly joined the war as soon as Hitler began invading Europe. But the reality is more complicated. In the early years of the conflict, America largely stayed on the sidelines. Most Americans did not want their country dragged into another overseas war. Instead of sending troops into battle, the United States focused on economic power. It traded with allied nations and supplied them with materials and weapons, but it avoided direct military involvement. At that time, America's military strength was actually quite modest. The U.S. armed forces ranked around 19th in size globally. In fact, the American army was smaller than Portugal's military. In other words, before entering World War II, the United States was not yet the military superpower people know today. But then history changed in a single day. December 7, 1941. A surprise attack. Japan bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack killed roughly 2,400 Americans, and including sailors, soldiers, and civilians. The nation was shocked, and from that moment forward, the United States officially entered World War II. The entire country quickly shifted into wartime mode. Factories across the nation began operating day and night. Production lines expanded rapidly to build aircraft, tanks, and warships. Automobile factories that once produced civilian cars were converted into plants manufacturing tanks and bombers. Millions of Americans joined the armed forces. The entire country mobilized for one goal: victory. But even then, the government faced a serious challenge. Many companies were hesitant to invest heavily in weapons production. From their perspective, war was a risky gamble. If the conflict ended suddenly, the massive investments required for factories, machinery, and raw materials could leave companies with enormous losses. To solve this problem, the U.S. government introduced a clever policy: guaranteed profit contracts. Under this system, the government agreed to cover all production costs and then add a guaranteed percentage of profit for the company. This meant that even if the war ended early, businesses would not lose money. That policy completely changed corporate attitudes. From that moment on, America's war machine began operating at full capacity. Ford converted its factories to produce B-24 bombers at incredible speed. At one point, they could complete a bomber roughly every hour. General Motors shifted from producing cars to manufacturing tanks and aircraft engines. Hundreds of companies joined the defense industry, and with that, a new economic reality was born: a massive wartime economy. When World War II ended in 1945, many people expected the United States to scale back its military, but that did not happen. By that point, defense production accounted for nearly 40% of the American economy. Tens of millions of Americans depended on jobs connected to the war industry. If that machine suddenly stopped, millions could lose their livelihoods. And that is when a powerful concept emerged: the military-industrial complex.
As you can see, Southeast Asia
President Dwight Eisenhower warned Americans about
Europe,
this system.
Massive gains
It described a network of influence connecting defense contractors, politicians, and the military itself. Defense companies fund political campaigns. Politicians approve larger military budgets. The Pentagon awards contracts to those same companies. And when military leaders retire, many of them later join defense corporations. It becomes a closed loop of power. From that point forward, war was no longer just a conflict between nations. It was also a massive system of economic interests. And when profit becomes tied to war, peace can become much harder to achieve. Because when wars end, profits may disappear as well. And perhaps that explains why history seems to repeat itself. One war ends, another begins. Today, the world talks about Ukraine. Tomorrow, it may be the Middle East. After that, somewhere else entirely. The real question is not who wins a war, The real question is why war never truly seems to end.